Reverend Dr. Willie Dwayne Francois III, welcome to Theology U, where we talk to academics and authors about God and faith in a way that anybody can understand. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Will, and for establishing this platform for people to explore new ideas and expand certain types of awarenesses. So happy to be here.
Yeah, man, I really love doing it. You're kind of a perfect guest for the show. You have the academic background. You're pastor of a church. You preach regularly. So to me, this is like perfect. Plus all the things that you're involved in. It took me like 5 minutes to record your introduction, just with all the organizations that you work with.
Sorry about that.
No, it's all good stuff. But we're talking about a book today that you wrote a couple years ago now. And as we talk about it, I'm interested to see how you think things have changed since you wrote this book in 2022. So I think we'll get there maybe towards the end. But it's called Silencing White Noise, 6 Practices to Overcome Our Inaction on Race. What inspired you to write this book in the first place?
Yeah, so Silencing White Noise is my second book project. And you may remember about 4 years ago, we were in the throes of an unusual social arrangement where everything was halted, life was paused, we were all cocooned at home, and that health crisis was being mismanaged in a lot of ways, which added to the kind of racialized, class-based terror that Black folk, brown folk experience in this country. In a lot of ways, the pandemic exposed some of the pre-existing social conditions that led to death for so many non-white folk, but also exposed what I now call a democratic grief. That people were grappling with the failure of public life, the failure of public institutions to live up to what they say they are invested in. And in the middle of that, George Floyd dies, and then Breonna Taylor dies, and then Ahmaud Arbery is also killed. And although that is not an uncommon cocktail in this country, the fact that we were all paused and forced to stare at death for almost 9 minutes in Minneapolis, and then the onslaught of more and more extrajudicial killings, police-based killings, it summoned me to ask myself the question, after spending years of doing anti-racism work, was I really doing enough? And then more than that, my wife gave birth to our now almost 5-year-old son. And I had to grapple with a more existential question of, man, is it morally right to bring a Black boy into a world, into a country that is an organized conspiracy against him? And all of those things are at work with how I am thinking about the lens for this book, thinking about the methodologies for practice that I try to lift in the book. What type of spirituality is required for us to actually confront the demonic nature of white supremacy? And then another component happens. January 6th occurs. And I understand January 6th to be an unusual and tragic confluence of whiteness, Christian nationalism, and a type of despotism, a type of authoritarianism, which I was wholly unfamiliar with as an American project, right? And so I think that the specter of all of those things at work led me to this text and led me to think about, for years, I was committed to, no, we need structural systemic change. And that is also true. But I hadn't really given enough attention. I hadn't really placed a premium on how individuals carry out what institutions and systems are designed to do. And so it really drafted me into thinking about, how do we hold the interpersonal anti-racism and the institutional anti-racism together, and you get the product you have in Silencing White Noise.
Yeah, well, I do remember those crazy times. I remember watching Twitter live streams of Minneapolis after George Floyd and just being amazed at what was happening. Um, I mean, truly, like for so many reasons, stuff that is burned in all of our collective memories. I think between all the things you brought up, COVID and all of it, um, and that summary makes it feel like hard to know even where to start. I mean, how do you even begin talking about it looking back, right? I mean, it would take us
Right.
years to rehash it. I think maybe a place to start is in the title of your book, um, with this term white noise. I know you mentioned an organized conspiracy. What is white noise would be a good place to start. We'll go from there. How do you describe what you'd call white noise?
So I was reaching for a metaphor that felt accessible, but also tied together the systemic and the interpersonal and the individual. As we talk about racism, one of the dangers of talking about racism as only interpersonal is there's this tendency to slouch into believing racism is only connected to what individuals are doing. And we limit it to the most gross manifestations of that, whether it's actually killing someone, whether it is explicitly using race as a barrier for hiring, or epithets like nigger, right? And we tend to think that is what racism is. And if we're not doing that, if we're not involved in that, then therefore we're not practicing racism. But white noise allows us to think about the language, the discourse, the logics, the practices that are at work that are lulling us to sleep. So my concern with white noise is less about the flagrant races and more about the way whiteness as an ideology, not an identity, whiteness as a form of power, not a category of ancestry, is at work in all of us. And sometimes it is most at work in us, lulling us to sleep,
Mm.
silencing us, muting us, restricting our courage. So when I think about white noise, I'm thinking about the sounds that are everywhere, that are inundating our lives, that cause us to not see how white power is at work, that causes us to put minoritized communities in competition with each other. This noise, the things that are happening on a daily basis, from our classrooms to our X feeds, that are telling us there's nothing we can do about racism, or racism does not exist. Though white noise, I think, helps me to hold all those things together, but also challenge the ways those of us who are non-white and those of us who are white and progressive are also a part of this meta crisis, in ways that we aren't always fingering, in ways we aren't always accessing. So that is how I think about, white noise as a metaphor for how white supremacy works in this world. What is it causing us not to say, not to do, not to show
Mhm.
up? Which is how I get the counter image for this kind of intercessory engagement. Is we are supposed to show up, speak up, and act up on behalf of those who are more vulnerable as a result of their race and the ways that race intersects with those other categories of difference and domination.
Yeah, and what are some of the ways that you see it? I know, um, and I think it's an important point to you can't talk about only interpersonal, and you also can't only talk about the institutional. They're both
Right.
important, right? They're both inextricably linked to each other. So maybe just to kind of keep getting ourselves into the conversation, what are some of those ways where you have felt the noise, where you see the noise, where you see it
Yes.
impacting other people? Um,
Yeah. In the book, I tell a story about my years as a boy preacher, 16 years
mm,
old, preaching at a church in Galveston, Texas. And in the middle of the sermon, I make this turn. I don't know if it was impromptu, but I make this turn to talking about it. It is seared into my memory. I make
mm,
this turn to talk about a stream of shootings that happen in a housing development that we call the projects. And in this sermon, in this black church, I'm talking about these people who have committed some type of gun violence as as other than me, as part of the problem with racism, needing
Mm,
to pick up their pants and take responsibility for their own poverty, right? I am aping, right, all of the anti-black talking points that I learned from a social studies teacher who happened to
mm,
be white in school, right? And I am now not doing the kind of textured reading of what's going on there as a symptom of poverty and limited opportunity. I'm talking about black gun violence as if black folk are inherently violent. I'm using tropes like
mm,
black on black crime, when the reality is almost all crime is intraracial. But we don't talk about white on white crime. We don't talk about Mexican on Mexican crime. We don't talk about El
mm,
Salvadorian on El Salvadorian crime. We don't talk about Korean on Korean crime. But we have essentialized black crime as something that is inherent and organic to black folk, right? And I'm doing
mm,
that as a black preacher, young notwithstanding. I'm doing it as a black preacher, and it is being received with thunderous applause, right?
mm,
Because that kind of anti-black thinking is a part of the white noise that we imbibe, that we hear, that lulls us to sleep. That's one way. And on one hand, it is interpersonal. It's me as an individual talking about black people to black people. I would say regurgitating what I have received from a white person in authority. But as a preacher, I am also endowed with certain institutional authority. In some
mm,
ways, I whip that church into being another stumbling block, another hurdle for underserved, divested from black communities that churches should be engaged in helping to partner with, collaborate with. But here we are casting them as something other than us, those over there, that type of black person. That's a way that it shows up.
mm,
White noise shows up, particularly in this historical moment where diversity, equity, and inclusion are being gutted wholesale, and we are seeing this specter raise again, that diversity, equity, and inclusion is giving to people something they have not earned, something they're not qualified for, something they haven't worked for, without understanding that the DEI movement is a response to the massive inequality that has denied black gifts, denied Latin A intelligence, denied women's capacity for leadership. And now we're talking about DEI as an assault on white men and certain types of white women, right? Like, that is white noise at work. The belief that is now the government is now excluding and discriminating against the majority community on behalf of folk who have historically lived on the underside of power. White noise is what allows us to see DEI as a threat to as a threat to white skills, white capacity, white
mm.
hiring, white ownership, right? And we know those things aren't true, but white noise allows us to believe that they are.
Yeah, that's a great transition. I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned that the notion of being colorblind is a stance of mythic innocence. Could
Yeah.
you talk more about that? About how you see that as just like not, not a viable position to be in? Because that's something you hear a lot. I'm not racist. I'm colorblind. I don't see color. So
Right.
why do you think that's not a helpful way to talk about it?
So on one hand, I think it's a mythic innocence that people uh, want to live into. Like, it's a badge of honor to say I don't see
Mm,
color for some people, and that's a
mhm,
kind of mythic innocence. I think the another corollary of that is the intentional unseeing of Black and brown pain, right? So you have one community that uses it as a way of demonstrating that they really are attempting to live into the beloved community, to see everyone as equal. But it's fraudulent. It's not real. It's an innocence that you're trying to see to yourself that is unhelpful to the overall work of anti racism and racial justice and equality. And then you have this other community that is intentional about denying and erasing the historic and contemporary pains of entire groups of people. That's the danger of color blindness, because to not see my skin color, which is impossible not to see, to not see my skin color is also to deny the experiences that come along with this skin color, that this body, right, moves through the world with certain consequences. There's certain experiences that are mapped onto this body that other types of bodies may not have to experience, right? There's certain bodies that don't know what it feels like to be surveilled in a grocery store or a retail store. There's certain bodies that don't know what it feels like to have blue lights flash in your rear and you tense up 10 and 2 because you don't know how that encounter with the police will feel. There's certain bodies that don't know what it feels like to hear stories of family members who did not have the right to vote just 2 generations ago, right? So to deny the appearance of my skin color is also to say something about what you're not willing to know about my experience, right? And that is what makes that innocence tragic, right? That's what makes that innocence a danger to the overall project of building a multiracial democracy. I believe in human oneness, but I do not have a commitment to human sameness. And what I mean by that distinction is that even though we may all be naturally similar, right? Biologically, there's very little difference between white people and black people. We are one race in that sense, right? Our makeup is one race biologically, but sociologically, politically, we are not the same, right? We should try to achieve a type of oneness where my blackness can live alongside your whiteness, and someone else's queerness can live alongside my, hetero identity. Those things should be real. That someone's culture may be distinct from another community's culture, but those things live together as co-equals, right? And as co-creators to what the American project is. That kind of oneness I would love to see as somebody who is radically committed to the idea of the beloved community, radically committed to the idea of the human person as the bearer of God's image in the world. I would love for oneness to be the policy of the day, but it is that lack of sameness that is being reinforced by our economic arrangements, reinforced by our political institutions, reinforced by almost every institution in this country, that we are forced to accept the fact that we have to take account for the beauty of difference that exists across cultures, but also take account for how we have used difference as a way of denying and dominating other groups of people. And all of that work, as messy as it sounds, even coming out of my mouth, as convoluted as it sounds, as I'm talking about, that's the hard work that we're actually called to do in this particular moment.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
innocence doesn't help us, right? I didn't mean to step on you, over you in that
No.
moment, but innocence doesn't help, because the more we lean into our mythic innocence, the more we get to turn our back on reality, and we tell ourselves we are not a part of the problem. But our silence and our intentional and willful indifference, apathy, non-engagement in the work of justice making, in the work of liberation, um, we are finding ourselves in a moment where we're letting ourselves off the hook in ways that we should not.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I'm glad you kept going. I was just gonna say I want to stay on this point because I think it's a good one. And you just mentioned the hard work is to claim, for me to claim color blindness is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is to want to move forward faster than is appropriate. Like you said, 2 generations ago, not everyone had the right to vote, which is insane. Like when you say it out loud, you think, how is that even possible? And you think, for me to insist on color blindness,
I
like you're,
am the in my
yeah, go.
family, when I consider my immediate family, I am a part of the first generation of my family to be born with the right to vote.
Yeah, it's so
My
crazy.
mother was born right before the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed. Right, so technically, she had the right to vote once she became 18, but literally born with the right to vote, that's me. Born in 1986, born
Mhm.
with the right to the protected right to vote. My mother was not born with that.
Yeah, it's so crazy. And so then to insist on moving forward and saying, okay, we're all equal now, it's all good, is it's moving too quickly without doing the work required to
Yeah.
reckon with that. Correct? Would you agree with how I'm wording that?
I wholly believe in your characterization of this, which is why in the book I talk about reparative intercession. That the work that we have
Mm,
to do has to be a reparative ethic. We cannot rush to kumbaya. We cannot rush to oneness. We cannot rush to a sense of equality and unity until we have slowed the process down enough to repair the harms that are being inflicted, and definitely those that have been inflicted historically. So the idea for reparative justice is a sense for us, or it's a mandate for us to take a beat, actually do a diagnosis of where we are, figure out how we heal from this, and then we can get to the point of reconciliation. We like to jump to reconciliation without doing the work of justice and repair. There, without justice and repair, reconciliation is a spiritual farce that we get to use as an excuse for doing nothing, as an
mm.
excuse for not taking account of what got us here. There's a history that is alive in every single moment of our racial tribulation in this country. And unless we try to dig into that history and start to heal it and heal people with repair, we're not actually doing ourselves any favors.
I think that's brilliantly said. I'd love to hear you talk next about how you see your faith informing this conversation, where you see the biblical mandate to fight against racism, and how you see your faith, or how you feel your faith informing uh, the justice work that you talk about and what you're doing.
Sure, sure. So I lead with a full-throated commitment to the Latin concept of the Imago Dei, the sense that all human flesh is created in the image of God. This liberating, abolition actualizing, human loving God. Right. My faith grounds there. And companion to this sort of theological anthropology grounded in intimacy in God's image, I also, and God's presence, God's pan presence. I also have this this radical appreciation for the love ethic of Jesus, that I don't really know how to practice the way of Jesus without grounding that love ethic. Loving your neighbor as you love yourself seems very clear. What it says is that no one lives outside of your moral sphere of concern. What it says is no one should be denied the practice of love that Jesus inculcates in us, that Jesus, his at least Jesus teaching should socialize us to do, to engage. And so it's this love ethic of Jesus that draws me, and then to historically contextualize Jesus as someone who is raised in a lynched, or to use better language, Jesus is raised in a crucified community. That Jesus is not the only person that is crucified. We often like to tell the story in that way, and we forget that even as we tell the story of the Passion, he is crucified between two people who were considered rebels, who were considered threats to the Roman government. I know we call them thieves, but that's really a misnomer for characterizing these two people that Jesus dies between on a Roman death machine. So Jesus is a Palestinian Jew who is a second class citizen in a colonized land, colonized by the Roman government, settler colonialism by the Roman government. In some ways, the religious elite, not the religious people, the religious elite have been co-opted by this Roman imperial government, and Jesus is a victim to them. But Jesus comes from a long line of Jews who were victims of Roman crosses. I often talk about Jesus as somebody who was born into a manger to cross pipeline. That Jesus comes from a people who were formerly enslaved, who are now conquered and colonized, who live in a manger to cross pipeline. That helps me. This is like Howard Thurman talking, right? That helps me to contextualize the Black experience in the United States and so many other experiences across the world. I won't go there because that's not what you invited me to talk about. But this experience of being conquered and dominated, second classed in your own land, right? That's the Jesus story, right? And then the symbol of resurrection, right? And I always talk about the resurrection as a symbol. The symbol of resurrection indicates that there's something about who we are as people created in the image of God to rebel against those forces of death making, like mass incarceration, like police brutality, like queer antagonism, particularly the kinds of transphobia that we're seeing now, where our trans sisters and brothers are literally vulnerable to death for attempting to be themselves, right? The kind of massive economic degradation that exists from rural communities to the harder places like Harlem and the Bronx, right? To be able to hold those narratives together, that's a Jesus move, because I take seriously Jesus' story, not just his resurrection, but I take seriously those years that get him to the cross. Those years as a second class citizen in an empire that refused to make space for that kind of power, that kind of beauty, that kind of religious and spiritual genius. And
Yeah,
then
I mean,
and then that love ethic of Jesus that he talks about, it's not just love your neighbor, it's the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, set the captive free, recovery of sight to the blind, declaring this is the acceptable year of the Lord. The Jesus love ethic says, when I was hungry and you fed me, when I was thirsty and you gave me drink, when I was unhoused and you housed me, you've done it. As you've done it to the least of these, you've also done it to me. Jesus finding simultaneity, right, with those who are oppressed is this love ethic that we just can't ignore if we're going to be followers of the way.
yeah, I love it. I love your use of the way, how they describe the early church in Acts. I think is awesome. And don't forget, Jesus had to flee his home country because his people were being mass killed because of their religion and ethnicity. I mean, even that alone. I mean, he was forced into another country for his entire childhood.
I don't know how we can have such draconian policies and normalization of mass deportation as Christians when we are literally students of a person who was an infant refugee, like literally pushed out of his own country because of political violence. And we are okay with deporting people illegally to an El Salvadorian prison. I think that's dangerous, man. It's dangerous because we don't allow ourselves to see Jesus in those same realities that Jesus survived. en route to an execution by his government.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think there's much more to say on that. Agreed. And yes, you talk about in the book some practices of anti-racism, some
Mm-hmm.
productive steps. I don't want you to spoil the book. I do think people should read it. But would you be willing to talk about maybe a couple of those, or just the spirit behind them? Maybe some
Yeah.
steps. If
So
someone's listening, and thinks, "Oh yeah, I think you're right." What are some steps, to help?
so I'll broad stroke it if I can, because like you, I do want people to get the book, and I
Hmm.
know my publisher does as well. Uh, but you know, we've talked about this one already, and that is, it is a perspectival shift that we actually name color as real, being color conscious. One writer talks about being color brave versus color blind. To see color is to also allow yourself to see the pains and the massive inequalities that people are living under on a daily basis. I talk about, we don't need white guilt, we need white grief. We don't need racial
Mm.
guilt. We need racial grief. That we have to grieve our way. I opt for guilt over grief. I opt for grief over guilt, because it says that something has to die, not a person, but something has to die. Our sense of superiorities have to die. Our sense of inferiorities have to die. Our sense of being one who claims to know it all must die in the process. Our attachments, our unquestioned attachments to our privileges has to die, right? So I talk about it as grief because it names something has to die, but I also talk about it as grief because it includes guilt, because some of the things that we've not done should evoke a sense of guilt that moves us to action. I call it grief because it doesn't allow us to stay at guilt. It requires us to heal from it. And grief names that healing is possible, right? When I talk about cues to color, that first chapter there, the chapter after the introduction, I'm talking about our commitment to seeing what actually is, embracing the divinity of difference, and allowing that sense of superiority to die so we can grieve our way into oneness one day. Another piece of this that I think is important. One of the chapters is called pattern recognition. That one is I think most credible for this moment, where we still see these untenable divisions between working class white people and black communities, right? And what we often forget is that working class white people and black communities, and black people, they often live together, they often work together, they often go to the same schools, but there's a wedge that exists between them. And I think that that's what I talk about in that chapter, is the threat of racial capitalism. Is that we forget how capitalism, classism, works in tandem with racism. And if we are honest, we would actually be able to see that the same policies that hurt black people are also policies that hurt working class white people. And the majority of white people in this country are working class, right? Which means the majority of white people actually have something in common with the majority of black people. And that commonality is that there is a structural threat to all of us, right? And so it would allow us, pattern recognition, to see that we're all really facing the same types of structural and systemic evils. When we talk about white folk that go to jail, that make up mass incarceration as well, we're talking about working class and poor white folk, right? And who are living out the same types of outcomes as black people. But we're unable to see those patterns. We're unable to see that connection, because of what Du Bois calls the psychological wage of whiteness. Because the wage of whiteness says, yes, I may be poor. Yes, I may not be as respected by the white elite, but at least I'm not black. Which used to be in the day, at least I'm not a slave. So you have these laboring white folk who are at the bottom of the economic and political ladder, don't have the right to vote either in this country before the 15th Amendment is passed. Like, we forget that the 15th Amendment also helps poor white folk get the right to vote, right? Interesting. We don't talk about that, but it is true. And this is why Du Bois says, if laboring white people and black people ever realized that capitalism was the problem, we would finally have a multiracial democracy where power was equally distributed. Right? But we haven't been able to do that because of the seduction of whiteness as an ideology, whiteness as a power construct. It's not about skin color for me. It's not about ancestry for me. But whiteness as a power construct, we've not been able to show that there are patterns, to recognize the patterns that actually tie black and white folk together in a country that, has always privileged wealth, but is now increasingly slouching towards an oligarchy and a plutocracy. And we just have to be honest about how billionaires are running the country right now, and millionaires are allowing them to do it with their campaign contributions. And then maybe the last thing I would say in terms of practice is what I call syncopated selves, or syncopated identity. How do we explore the fullness of who we are? This tracks back to something I was attempting to say earlier, is when you have a syncopated sense of self, when you're able to see your various identities at once, is what we call in the academy intersectionality. That we realize that we carry multiple identities in a single self, multiple identities in this body. When this body shows up, it's not just a black body. It is a male body. It is a middle class body. It is a Christian body. It is a citizen body. And the fact that I am a part of a racial community that has been historically underprivileged and exploited and denigrated, that doesn't cancel out my male privilege. It doesn't cancel out my citizenship privilege, my sexuality privilege, right? And so to do a power analysis of my own life, a power analysis of the self, is for me to be honest about how my black underprivilege lives alongside my class privilege, my citizenship privilege, my religious privilege, on and on and on. And that's the kind of work we have to do if we really want to be engaged in real liberation, is that we can't, it's easy for me to say, well, my male privilege doesn't exist because I'm black. And that we just know that's not true. And that is part of the work that we have to do within ourselves, to think about what our what our ancestors may say, what my ancestors might say about the idea of Bayard Rustin in particular, is that we have to declutter our spirits of the empire if we really want to change the empire. Right? We got to get whiteness out of our souls if we really want to get whiteness out of our economy, out of our politics, and out of our democracy.
I want to ask, as we close, you mentioned some authors that as you've been going. For someone who what you're saying is really resonating, but thinks, I still don't really know what you're talking about, or I want to learn more, or I want to see exactly what you're getting at. What are some things maybe to read or people to Google?
I think Ta-Nehisi Coates is someone we should be reading right now as a contemporary. I think every chance we can revisit the canon of James Baldwin, we should. And his fiction, which helps to perfume some of what we're talking about, but because of its pictorialness and its prose, but also his cultural criticism, the stuff he writes. Like, I would say particularly, you want to read The Fire next time. You want to read that. I would say we should spend some time reading the works of folk like Monica Coleman, who's a theologian who is based in California, and she really helps us to think about Black women's lives theologically, spiritually, even. And that's a text I always encourage people to explore. I mentioned this earlier, but Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman should be required reading for anyone that says that they are a follower of Jesus, Christian or otherwise, a follower of Jesus. And I want to say that we should probably be committed to the work of folk like Brittany Cooper, who is Rutgers professor, and just she makes the interlocking crisis of power in the United States legible. So Brittany Cooper is another person I say we should read.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing. Thanks for your honesty, your personal perspective. I think it's really helpful. All the research that you've done, the time you spent writing on it is much appreciated, underappreciated. So just thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for sharing and you're earnest about it. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you for having me, and I look forward to how the Theology U world will continue to grow as you host these conversations. Very, very consequential conversations in a time where so much is at stake and so much that we hold precious is vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that.